So let's take a look at flowers in more detail. This diagram we've seen several times, or something like it, that shows all of the parts necessary to understand how flowers function in making fruits. And let's take a look at a slightly more intricate version that shows some of the collective terms. And we will recall, I meant to write sepals here, that all of the sepals considered collectively is called the calyx. And all the petals considered collectively is called the corolla. And both of these series of parts, which surround the rest of the flower, the sexual parts of the flower, typically the anthers, is called the perianth. The word peri means around, and anth means anthers, male part. Looking at the male parts, each individual one is called a stamen, and the collective term for them, all of the stamens considered collectively, is called the andrecium. Andrecium means basically male house. It's the male parts of the flower. Similarly, although a little more intricately, the stigma, style, and the ovary can be referred to as the pistil. And we're going to see some subtleties in the way in which terms like this are used. But I'd like for us to think of all of the female parts of the flower considered collectively to be called the gynecium. There's another term that is sometimes used incorrectly, but we're going to be very deliberate about it. It's called the carpel, which is the basic unit. I'm putting it in brackets here. Put a pin in that for learning about it later. It's the basic unit of the gynecium, and we're going to learn the distinction between pistil and carpel and gynecium, and learn how to use those terms correctly. So let's take a look at some flowers. When I say typical flowers, what I mean is flowers that have all of the parts. And in this case, sepals, petals, stamens, and pistil or pistils. And this is a flower that's in the mustard family. Here we can see down below sepals, there are 4 of them. Petals, there are 4 of them. Stamens, there happen to be 6 of them. 4 are long and 2 of them are short. And here in the middle of the flower is the pistil. If you like labels, boom, labels. And let's take a look at some more flowers. Here's one that's a geranium, and it's got some aspects to it that are what we've seen so far. So here we have some sepals that are slightly hiding behind, alternating with the petals, as sepals most frequently do. And we have stamens. I'm pretty sure there's 10 of them. Often the number of stamens is some multiple of the number of petals, but not always. And there's a pistil that's right here in the middle of the flower. A little hard to make out unless you look carefully. And there's something interesting about this flower that's sort of extra. Let me tell you about it. This particular species exhibits something called protandry. And protandry means male first. Pro before, and andry is the male thing. And that has to do with the sequential, not simultaneous, maturation of the sexual parts of the flower. And the flower on the right, this one I've been drawing on, is a nice young fresh flower. And notice please that there's stamens with they look sort of granular because there's pollen on them, and that pistil that I drew for you is a little hard to see, and it's kind of ends bluntly. And this particular flower is a young one, and it's in the male phase. The stamens are mature, but the pistil isn't. The pistil actually has 5 lobes, but they're held together tightly, kind of like a fist, like with fingers outstretched, which isn't how fists are, but they're held together. Later on, after the stamens have dispersed their pollen, then the female phase takes place. Now this flower on the left is really old, the petals have fallen off, but imagine they're still there, because what I want to depict is, notice the pistil has stigmas, lobes at the tip, 5 of them, and they're spread very wide. They're receptive to pollen. This happens after the stamens have matured and released their pollen. So protandry, it means male first. The flowers are not male and female at the same time, but they have both parts, but the male ones are mature before the females are. This is a means to minimize, not eliminate entirely, but minimize self-pollination. The reason it doesn't eliminate it entirely is because while it prevents pollination within a flower, it doesn't prevent pollination between flowers on the same plant. So this flower could transfer pollen to this one when it was a little bit younger anyway, but in the female phase. But individual visits to a flower from insects are less likely to result in that genetically deleterious self-pollination. And here's some labels. We keep forgetting about pedicel. The pedicel is the stalk of an individual flower. Here's another flower. It's called spiderwort, and one of the things you do when you study botany is you count. And notice we have 3 petals. There's also 3 sepals. That's a pretty good clue that this is a member of the subgroup of angiosperms called monocots, monocotyledons. They typically have flower parts in 3s, and a few other differences that we'll go into soon. It's called spiderwort. And here's the labeled stamens and pistil and petals comprising the corolla and sepals comprising the calyx. Here's one that's a kind of a degenerate morning glory. What I mean is, it's related to the morning glories, but it is a parasitic plant. It's called dodder. And what it does is it sprouts, and then right after being a young seedling, it leans onto and then puts suckers into neighboring vegetation and derives all its nutrition after the seedling stage by being a parasite. But in terms of reproduction, it's a totally flowering plant with all the flower parts that we learned about. A calyx consisting of 5 sepals, petals kind of fused together and hard to make out individually. Corolla consisting of 5 petals, a pistil, and some stamens. So some of the ways in which flowers vary is to not have all of those parts. And it's kind of an old-fashioned term, but to call those incomplete flowers. But it's a useful distinction to make, and sometimes you'll see the term. Incomplete flowers are flowers that are lacking one or more of any of those things. Lacking sepals, or lacking petals, or lacking stamens, or lacking pistils. Those are called incomplete flowers. And here's an example of a so-called incomplete flower. It's an elm, and they're sexually they have both parts. They have a pistil, and this is a big expanded, kind of puffy stigma, and they have stamens. These are stamens, and the reason that they're lacking any colorful perianth parts is because they're wind pollinated, and plants that are wind pollinated often don't have colorful parts because wind, and also they tend to have large kind of antenna-like stigmas. Here's some parts labeled. Pedicel. Okay, here's a walnut, black walnut, and black walnut has a pollination syndrome that's kind of characteristic of a lot of forest trees. Black walnut is monoecious. It means one house, and what is in one house are male flowers and female flowers. In other words, the flowers are unisexual, but the plants aren't. Each plant has both male and female flowers. And black walnut, like a number of forest trees, including oak and beech and hickories, they have their male flowers are in what are called catkins. So these dangling structures here consist of, this is a syndrome adaptation for wind pollination, as you'll see. So these drooping catkins have many, many male flowers. They don't have sepals and petals. There's lots of them. They're really small. They're aggregated together in this drooping jabberoo, and it's called a catkin, and it's really good for having pollen blow in the wind. And that's the male flowers. The female flowers are much larger, comparatively few in number, and also lack any colorful parts. So what I just drew is up in the upper right-hand corner is a little cluster of female flowers. And there's a more sophisticated version of the diagram. And here's a close-up of those female flowers. And they've got important parts. They've got an ovary that matures into a big old walnut, and a style which connects the ovary to the stigma. And again, these stigma lobes are kind of big and expanded, kind of like antennae, really good for catching the pollen that's blowing through the air from those catkins. And that is kind of a typical pollination pattern for a number of forest trees. You know, oaks with their acorns, and hickories with their hickory nuts, and beeches with their beech nuts. Male flowers and catkins, female flowers comparatively few in number, much larger, but none of them having colorful parts because the wind don't care. Okay, here are some incomplete flowers that are what are sometimes called imperfect, which is a word that means unisexual, either male or female, but not like cosexual. And this particular plant also lacks petals and sepals. It's a plant called meadow rue, and if you look at this particular meadow rue is a male meadow rue, and if you look in details at the flowers, there's no sepals or petals. These are all stamens. They have long, slender filaments, and when pollinated plants tend to have long, slender filaments that catch the breeze really well. They're hard to take pictures of because even in the lightest breeze, they're moving. These are the male flowers, and these are the female flowers. There's one thing to notice about the female. So this here is one flower. One thing to notice is they don't have sepals or petals. The other thing to notice is that they don't have stamens. The other thing to notice is something extra coming up soon. Notice that they're actually, instead of having one stigma style ovary unit, there's bunches of them. They're like about a dozen. They're all clustered together. And that's a peculiar type of gynoecium that we'll learn is called apocarpus. Details forthcoming. Some of the variation in flowers is fairly straightforward, and it involves the petals and their symmetry. And the basic type, the most common type, sort of the primitive type, sort of there's a term for it, but it slips my mind, is radial symmetry. And that is what's illustrated here, where the petals are all about the same size and shape. And the you could draw, any line that you draw through the center of the flower will have identical halves, left and right. And that's like a wheel, radial symmetry. And the other way flowers can be with respect to symmetry is bilateral symmetry, kind of like a face, where you can only draw one line through it and have identical-ish halves. And there's a lot of overlap in terminology. The most technical way of describing radial symmetry is called actinomorphic. And it's just sort of a direct synonym for radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is called zygomorphic, and that's just another synonym for bilateral. Sometimes actinomorphic is called regular, and by a complementary term, actinomorphic is called irregular. Although then it gets a little bit confusing because sometimes the word irregular would be reserved for flowers that have some sort of squished, not even bilateral symmetry, which I can't think of any examples even. But some of the identification manuals that you'll encounter will use the word regular and irregular to mean the same as radial and bilateral, or as actinomorphic and zygomorphic. So different terms for the same really interesting condition. And this is a more advanced condition, this zygomorphic, because it is a way to coerce pollinators to orient themselves in a way that's optimal for transferring pollen. So here's an example, this bouncing bet, of a flower that's radially symmetric and like a wheel. Here's another example of this yellow star grass, which is totally not a grass, is radially symmetric. It's actinomorphic. It's regular. Here's a flower that's bilaterally symmetric, zygomorphic, irregular. It's a violet, and you can see that this one petal in the bottom is different than, there's nothing on the top like that, and they're sort of paired left and right. It's called irregular symmetry. Here's an example. It's it's an orchid. Orchids are very advanced, and they're all zygomorphic. And here's another example of a flower with a zygomorphic symmetry, and you can kind of see how this peculiar flower arrangement with the stigma here and the stamens happen to be fused into a tube, and the objective of having these flowers that are so contrived are to get pollinator, like this bee, to orient herself in just the right way to have the part of her body that would collect pollen also be near the part of the body that would receive or be oriented towards the stigmas to receive the pollen. So these are contrivances to enhance the likelihood of pollen transfer. Here's an example of a flower with bilateral symmetry. It's called touch-me-not. It's often pollinated by hummingbirds. The red-orange color is a good clue for that. It's got a lot of nectar in the base of this spur. Here's another picture of that flower with bilateral symmetry. Other things that can vary involving petals, and also involving sepals, but let's look at the petals because they're more dramatic, is whether or not the petals are fused. And the sort of ancestral condition, the simpler condition, is to have the petals be separate. So, you know, she loves me not. This is an example. This poppy is an example of a plant that has separate petals. And here's an example of a plant that has fused petals. Now, it might not be totally obvious because I kind of ripped this one apart, but this bottle gentian has 5 petals, but they're all fused together into a tube, so you only see the little tips of the lobes that give you a clue that there's 5 of them, which is a very common number anyway. But I ripped it apart, so it looks like it has separate petals, but it doesn't. Here are some stamens. Here's the pistil with these 2 stigma lobes. There, that's an example of fused petals. Here's another example of fused petals. Might not be super obvious, but this is phlox. It's a woodland wildflower. I took this picture about a week ago, and in Adams County, and it's got 5 petals. You can see that, but you see they're not separate. Look how they're. And here's an example that demonstrates it more dramatically, perhaps. This is a leaf with some petals that fell off of a phlox plant, and you can see they're all together. There's 5 petals, but they're not separate. Here's a tube, sort of a corolla tube. Sometimes there are stamens inserted on it, but they're still petals that are fused together. Here's another example of a plant with petals that are fused together. This is a honeysuckle. It's kind of an invasive, nasty honeysuckle. It's called Japanese honeysuckle. And it's also strongly zygomorphic. It's got, if I'm not mistaken, 4 petals at the top that are fused together, and then 1 at the bottom. And but most importantly, for the point of showing fusion, see there's a tube, a corolla tube, and the petals are lobes of a single unit. This is an example of a plant with a sympetalless corolla. Here's just a little background on this flower too. Here's a picture of one that's really old, past its prime in terms of attracting pollinators. It probably has been pollinated. So these petals are all wilted. What we have here is the style with the stigma on it, and You can see how nice and long that is. Here's another one. Ah! What's next? Relative insertion of floral parts. That looks complicated. Hypogynous with a superior ovary? Perigynous? Epigynous? That looks kind of complicated. I think we should take a break before we delve into something that complicated.